We're going to be moving along now in the timeline from that early first Christian community, and we left off looking at that Christian community in Rome, and I'm going to be moving us into the Middle Ages. So obviously when people were living in the Middle Ages, they didn't look at it that way. Everything is in its context. So from a historical point of view, we're usually talking about the period from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century up until the Renaissance around the 14th, 15th century. That's usually referred to as the medieval period or the Middle Ages. And so we see a very different development. That early community with the women who were like St. Fabiola, St. Marcella, who were involved with the earliest forms of hospice. The Christian community was still operating within that Roman Empire. But what we see by the 5th century is that the Roman Empire has fallen, and so all of the political apparatus have disintegrated. And so obviously it puts all of these regions into a certain amount of chaos, and so they have to rebuild their structures. And so the Christianity is maintained, but the structures are very different that are built out of the Middle Ages. Now, at the same time, in the 7th century, we're seeing the rise of Islam, very rapid rise of Islam, and I'll be talking about that more when we get to the Crusades. But that also becomes very important, that there's another religious tradition that is converting a lot of people in this time period. A very important part of all of this, if we're kind of zooming out, is that this would have been understood as Christendom. So all the regions that we would now call Europe, and even further than that, are understood as being Christendom. And so the idea of the nation state is not really what's important here. That comes later after the Reformation. But these societies would have understood themselves as one large area of a Christian civilization. And the Muslims had a very similar idea called Dar al-Islam, so the whole region that is under Muslim control that would have stretched from Saudi Arabia into India, northern India. So for Christians, they're understanding themselves as living within Christendom. So what does that mean? So first of all, there's already been a split in what was that Roman Empire, and so in 1054 there's a split between what becomes Eastern Orthodox, what we now call Orthodox Christianity, and Catholic Christianity. At one point they were all one, and so that gets split, and so the center of Roman Catholic Christianity becomes Rome, and so Rome and the Patriarch of Rome, that we now call the Pope, becomes the power in this region of Christendom. So Western Christianity then, for this period, is centered in Rome, and that holds until the Protestant Reformation, and obviously for Catholics it's still the center. So let's just look at what these structures would have looked like in Christendom. So it would have been split into sacerdotium, so religious authority with the Pope at the top of the hierarchy, archbishops, bishops, parishes, priests, etc. And the sacerdotium was often responsible for education and health care. And this shouldn't be that strange to anybody. I think a number of you, it sounds like from the discussion boards, went to Catholic school. So the idea of the church overseeing education is still operating in many cases. And certainly in the case of Quebec, until the Quiet Revolution, the church also oversaw all the hospitals. So this is something that should be, I think, a little bit familiar, actually. We tend not to think of it. And so the church within this setup is responsible for a lot of the institutions, including education. And again, there's still often a connection with religion and education. You may or may not know that at universities like the University of Toronto, there are Catholic colleges like St. Mike's, which have close affiliation with the church. So during this time period, religion permeates everything. It permeates all of the institutions of the state. So the other aspect is imperium, so secular leaders, kings, queens, their courts, city politicians. But we do have to be careful here, because the kings and queens would have seen themselves as serving a higher law, so serving religion. And I don't want to simplify this. There was a lot of jockeying, and we're going to see by when the Protestant Reformation comes around, this causes a split within the Christian church. But so there's a lot of jockeying for power, for sure, but certainly ideologically it would have been understood that that religion was at the top and secular power is below. During the Middle Ages, the political structure is what's usually referred to as feudalism, and so this would have been how everything was organized. So you already know the Pope and the Church are at the top, the monarch is underneath, and if you happen to see the coronation of King Charles, you'll see the Church is still involved with the coronation of the monarch, and the idea is that the monarch is then enacting the will of God. So beneath the monarch are the nobles, so the landed aristocracy. And so these people would often own vast estates of land, and then they would be responsible for the people living on that land. A lot of the landed estates, if not all of them, if we look at the English case, would have churches on them, and so the head of this estate would be responsible for paying for that. And then below the nobles, the knights and the vassals, and then the merchants, the farmers, the craftspeople, and the peasants and the serfs. And so you can see this is definitely an extremely hierarchical society and very rigid. People were expected to stay mostly within their set place. Now, that, of course, is never completely true, and we know that people always push against that, and there's many forces. So the nobles are jockeying with the monarchs and so on, and the monarchs are jockeying with the Pope and so on. So in any human society, this is happening. But certainly the idea was this is a fixed hierarchy with God at the top. So some of you may be familiar with the idea of the great chain of being, and certainly with very rigid gender roles, for instance. So all of these hierarchies would have been kind of stacked on top of one another. Now, if we look at that section of the merchants, the farmers, and the craftspeople, these would have been growing in power. So the merchants, particularly as society starts to the population starts to expand and there are sort of improved forms of agriculture, we see this merchant class growing. And eventually this builds into what we would now call the middle class, and it gains a tremendous amount of power. And if you're following the American election, that's all they talk about is the middle class. And also in Canada, the middle class, the middle class. So within feudalism, there was no sense of that, but that starts to happen. We'll see by around the time of the Protestant Reformation. So I realize this may seem long ago and far away, but if any of you have watched Downton Abbey, that is essentially a feudal estate that's beginning to have to attend to modernity by the 20th century. But a lot of these aristocrats in countries like England only sold their estates in the 20th century, and some of them still remain. So this structure has had a huge amount of influence, and the idea would be that these peasants or serfs would farm the land of the lord of the manor, and so they would have to pay him a certain amount, a percentage, and then they would keep a percentage. So so this structure was very solid for a very long time, and it didn't really come under a great deal of stress until the time of the things like the French Revolution and then the World Wars. I want to look now at 4 types of institutions dedicated to what we would now call healthcare. So the first one being the almshouses, so alms being charitable donations. So each church would be taking in tithes, would be taking in donations, and then part of that would go to the upkeep of the church and part would go to charity. So I already talked about that concept in the last lecture. And so we see the building of almshouses, so housing for those in need, particularly the elderly, run by religious orders. And in researching this topic, I have come to now know that these still exist. I was really taken aback by this. And in fact, they provide housing for people that have less money, who aren't able to pay the now very exorbitant rents that we often have to pay. And so almshouses almshouses still exist, and there's one in England from the 10th century that still exists called St. Oswald's. So the idea, this again can seem strange, but if we think about it, I'm sure some of you know in your communities there are forms of housing attached to churches that are for low-income people that have lower rents. Also, in many communities, there are spaces dedicated to seniors that are also attached to churches. I know that in Aurora there's one being built right now right beside the church, and so there's often a direct connection between churches and taking care of those in need and the elderly. So that actually does continue into the present, even though clearly the secular state has taken over some of that. The second one, hospitals. Now, this you will know, meant for the care and cure of the sick. So the dividing line between hospital and hospice is not as clear, but we can see it even in the way it parses out today, that hospitals tend to be about curing people, and hospices are dedicated to those who are terminally ill. So that was there even in the Middle Ages. Also hospices for wayfarers and pilgrims, dedicated to pilgrims and travelers. And so these still exist. If you've heard of the Compostela pilgrimage, there are hostels all along that route that people can stay in, and it's considered a charitable act to host these pilgrims. The fourth is the Lazar or leper house, also run by religious orders. And so Lazar, referring to Lazarus from the New Testament, who Jesus brings back from the dead. And so people in the Middle Ages, this is something that gets lost. People think this is all new. Even in the ancient world, there was an understanding of contagious disease and epidemics and the idea of quarantine. So there was a recognition that leprosy, or Hansen's disease, was contagious, and so you had to remove these people from the community. So the churches would be responsible for building these communities where lepers could live. Now, many of them were still considered to be part of their communities, so they weren't completely ostracized, but they would be probably on the margins of the town. But these houses would be run by religious orders, so they would be cared for by members of these religious orders. So if we look at the founding of the monasteries and the nunneries, what we see is men and women who have taken vows of charity, poverty, and obedience, and so they're not owning property and they're not getting married and having families. And so what this results in, and I'll be talking about this more when we get to the nursing orders as well, is groups of people who give free labor, essentially. So the church supports them, but they essentially are this very large numbers of people who give their labor for religious ends. And so this would include teaching. A lot of them were teachers, and also caring for the sick and the elderly. And so we also see that the monasteries and the convents, this is actually true in the Buddhist world as well, the monasteries and the convents become centers of learning that then feed into the university system, but they also become places of healing and spaces for the terminally ill. So the monasteries and convents become these kind of hubs that serve the community. I want to look now at the Crusades, and obviously this is a vast topic and there are whole courses on this topic, and I won't be spending too much time on it, but it is important. And the Crusades are related again to that rise of Islam. And so by the Middle Ages, Islamic powers had taken over around 2/3 of what had been Christian territories or Christian-run territories. So there's a real kind of panic setting in. And so we see this manifestation of these political campaigns in an attempt to reclaim these lands, and particularly Jerusalem and what's referred to as the Holy Land by Christians. And so we start to see the rise of these knights who go to fight in the Crusades, often called up by the Pope himself. So there were a series of crusades from 1095 to 1270 CE, and this is such a vast topic, as I said, and some of it is like truly strange. So things like the Children's Crusade, so these adolescents who go off on crusade and disappear, and it's fascinating and strange, and it's a very complex phenomenon because clearly there are religious underpinnings, but as with all wars, there's also financial underpinnings. So a lot of these knights were enriching themselves through these crusades. And they were, as I said, meant to check the spread of Islam and take back what was considered to be the Holy Land of Palestine, and particularly the city most holy to Christianity, which is Jerusalem. And so they were successful a period of time, but largely the Crusades were not successful, and Muslims continued to rule those areas. Now, this is again, we have to be careful because Christians continue to live in those regions and they still live there. And they were considered usually to be people of the book, and so they had a special kind of dispensation that they didn't have to convert. Now that is changing, and that's the result of politics of our time. But certainly in the Middle Ages, it was very common for Jews and Christians to live under Muslim political regimes. So, and sometimes they would have to pay a tax, but they wouldn't be forced to convert, for instance. So as I said, the Crusades are a very complex phenomenon, and they led to a number of different results that were not necessarily foreseen, some of them good and some of them bad. But certainly they were opening up a lot of travel, and part of what they were doing was opening up travel to Palestine. Lest I be accused of being biased and only talking about women healers, I do want to look at the Knights Hospitaller of St. John. And so this was an order founded in Jerusalem by some of these crusaders. And so these were a series of orders that developed to protect, to be their knights, their warriors. And so we looked at that pyramid. So they're in the feudal hierarchy, they're knights, and so, as you can see from the armor that the one on the right is wearing. And so this is a rabbit hole on the internet. I was really fascinated to see. It would appear people are very fascinated by these orders, and so the most famous one, we're getting into Da Vinci Code territory, but is the Knights Templar, who are associated with the Temple of Solomon, and that goes into all sorts of mythology. But if you're interested, have a look. It's fascinating. But you can see the cross on the armor here, and so these orders are a very interesting blend of religious and knight. So the Knights Hospitaller were founded in the 11th century by the merchants of Amalfi, so in what is now Italy, to provide hospital care for pilgrims. So they were also, along with being knights and protecting people in that way, they were meant to give actual care, so physical care. So they acted as what we would refer to as doing kind of first aid for pilgrims along that route to Jerusalem and protecting them. And so during the 12th century, the order became militarized along with the Templars. And so the Hospitallers and the Templars took monastic vows, but their principal function was soldiering. So the monastic vows being of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so they were directly reporting to the Pope. And again, this is a very complex history because they start to cause, there starts to be a lot of jockeying for power with the bishops and the priests and so on, because they were kind of operating outside of the feudal system, and some of them were ruling whole kingdoms. And so eventually there is a crackdown on them, but for a period of time they were very powerful. And some of the kind of unexpected impacts of this were that they contributed to developing the first forms of banking in the Western world. And also they were opening up these trade routes and bringing back items from Palestine. And so this starts to open up trade and banking and so on. And so these were kind of the other impacts of these crusades, even though they weren't particularly successful in their main aims. I'm ending with this image, and I'm really struck that you know, I walk by the building of St. John's Ambulance all the time in North Bay, and it's just part of the landscape, and I've been aware of them for probably most of my adult life. But what I've come to realize is they're actually part of the Order of St. John. And if we look at the symbol, that's pretty clear. And so this is clearly the Canadian symbol, but the cross is there, that Maltese cross that was worn by the Knights Hospitaller. So if we go on to the Museum of the Order of St. John in Ontario, they offer a full history. So if you want to look at that, it goes back to the medieval Middle Ages. And so it says on their website, St. John Ambulance is a large volunteer first aid organization in the Commonwealth countries, Ireland and Hong Kong. There's also a priory, a national organization of its Order of Chivalry in the United States. It has been active in Canada since 1883. So the first St. John's in Canada was in Quebec City in 1883. It goes on to say, St. John Ambulance and the Order of St. John have a long, complex history. It has evolved from a hospital for pilgrims to a Christian crusader force to a humanitarian organization whose members and patients can be of any religion or no religion. And so it goes on to give the full history. So I did not know this again until I started researching the connection between these medieval orders and St. John's Ambulance. And when I really was thinking about it, when you think of a paramedic, you can kind of see the connection between that and these kind of militarized order. I have such admiration for people who do this kind of work. It just takes a degree of steadiness that is really truly admirable. And so with St. John's Ambulance, you really see that underpinning of the religious, that although they're secular now, they're a charitable organization, that larger religious underpinning is still there, and you can see it in the symbolism.